Good evening and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Library series of conversations on the history of the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining us for this first session in our 2021-22 year. We're happy to have you here. I'm Gary Krenz. I'm pleased to be joined by our presenter tonight, Matthew Johnson. I want to begin by saying, on behalf of my colleagues at the Bentley Historical Library, that as the archives of the University of Michigan, the Bentley Library acknowledges that the historical origins and present locations of the university were made possible by cession of lands by Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples under coercive treaties common in the colonization and expansion of the United States. We note in particular the grant of land made by the Anishinaabe under the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids for the College at Detroit so that their children could be educated. These lands continue to be the homeland of Indigenous people, and we seek to reaffirm and respect their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and to recognize their contributions to the university. Our presenter this evening is Matthew Johnson, who is Associate Professor of History at Texas Tech University and is the author of Undermining Racial Justice: How One University Embraced Inclusion and Inequality. The book, which I highly recommend, has just received a 2021 book prize from the Historical Society of Michigan. It is a detailed case study of the history of the university's approach to racial justice, how administrators have reacted to activism for racial justice, and how the policies they crafted, good intentions aside, consistently sacrificed racial equality to other university values. I think it is fair to say that this history is not unique to Michigan, and that one of the reasons the book is about Michigan is the extensive relevant holdings of the Bentley Library, which I believe that Matthew will say something about as well. But it is certainly an important dive into U of M and racial justice, an issue we have very much with us today. The book is a sweeping account of U of M history on this matter. Matt's presentation tonight will focus on a particular period, not the entire history. If the presentation interests you, I encourage you to delve into the book. It is a read well worth undertaking. And with that, thank you for joining us, Matt, and welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Krenz, for inviting me here. And thank you to everyone at the Bentley Historical Library. It's really an honor to be part of a series that's associated with Bentley. Bentley has really, the people at Bentley have really made my early career. This book would not have been possible without all of the work that folks have done for decades at the Bentley Historical Library, collecting and maintaining the institutional archives of the University of Michigan. It is, I think, the premier university archive in the country. And Bentley, of course, does more than collect stuff at the University of Michigan. But I do think this is the premier collection, and this is why I focused on the University of Michigan. And so this talk I've kind of set up as a big thank you to everyone at Bentley for welcoming me there, for doing all the hard work that made this book possible. So I'm going to try to bring out a lot of really good documents that allow me to read, to write this book, and to bring out all of the great work that the people at Bentley have done. And it's because of them that I was able to write this book that really focuses largely on the 1960s to the early 2000s, that looks at how administrators really constantly saw the demands of Black student activists as threats to the university status as one of the premier public institutions in the United States. And clearly, racial justice is not inherently incompatible with a premier public institution. It's only because administrators have long seen status and elite status in such a very narrow way that they saw that as incompatible. Right? They've long tied the university's status to the status of the student body, to people with having lots of students with high SAT scores, lots of national merit scholars, lots of students who've taken advanced placement courses, and all of those measures, of course, are measures that privilege particular racial and ethnic groups. And so what I wanted to do in this book is bring out a bunch of strategies administrators developed between the 60s and early 2000s that really tried to control the outcomes of Black activism and incorporate the goals of Black activists only so far as they didn't threaten what administrators believe was necessary to maintain Michigan's prestige. And so to bring that story out a little bit, I'm going to focus on this period between 1975 and 1983. And so I'm going to share my screen here to a you'll see this nice little graph here. I'm going to talk about this period where we see this dip in the line graph here between 1975 and 1983. And it's an important period because it's a period when Michigan changes its undergraduate affirmative action practices. And the basic principles of those practices continue for many decades. And so I don't have time to cover all those practices. Love to talk about them in the Q&A, but I want to bring out some of those practices by thinking about the consequences of this shift. And so if you look at the graph here, you see this big dip between 1975 and 1983. And if we just look at those numbers, just enrollment numbers in that dip, it can seem somewhat insignificant because Black enrollment begins to recover and eventually surpass the numbers of 1975, eventually reaching historic numbers by the mid-1990s. But if we just look at enrollment numbers, we miss just how important and long-lasting the changes to affirmative action admissions that were initiated in the mid-1970s have been, and how those changes fit into the story that I'm trying to tell about administrators trying to manipulate what inclusion looks like to protect the university from what they see as a threat to their prestige. And so the changes to affirmative action in the mid-1970s are important because never again will Michigan's affirmative action program for undergraduates focus on Black students living in Michigan's cities, especially Detroit. If you go back to 1964, where this graph starts, is when the University of Michigan first begins adopting affirmative action, a program called the Opportunity Program. At that moment, Michigan officials saw affirmative action as a way to address inequality rooted in urban America. And so that program was exclusively an in-state program, and it focused on recruiting Black students living in Detroit and also Flint and Grand Rapids. And the program provided a lot of need-based aid from the university's general fund to cover much of the cost of attending Michigan. And so in the 1960s, Black enrollment grows slowly. And you can kind of see at the early part of this graph here, it seems really steep in the 1960s at the beginning. And that's only because I have just a few data points for 64, 67, 69. The graph would really look a bit shallower if I had all of the dates in the 1960s there. What happens to this story is that the Black Action movement, the famous Black Action movement of the 1970s, really changes everything. And most significant to the story that I'm trying to tell today is that the protests got the university to concede to the goal of raising Black enrollment to 10% of the student body by the fall of 1973. And so the admissions office went to work trying to meet that goal within the structure of the Opportunity Program, focusing on Black students from Michigan cities, especially Detroit, and offering unprecedented amounts of need-based aid from the university's general fund. And so if I can go back to the graph real quick, you can see that the admissions office doesn't meet that goal by 1973. Right? It tops out really at 7.2% or so. Now, the problem is that the admissions office never really wanted to, never expected to use the Opportunity Program to greatly expand Black enrollment. They were really uncomfortable with the Opportunity Program as the primary vehicle to raise Black enrollment, especially after BAM. And when I look at all the records, you can really tell that the people in the admissions office saw themselves as the protectors of the university's academic standards. And they saw the SAT scores and high school records of Black Detroit students as threats to the university's future. And so once we get into 1974, 1975, you start to see people in the admissions and the Opportunity Program office start to use the failure to meet those BAM demands to argue that if the Opportunity Program expands any further, that the university would have to lower its academic standards, and consequently, it would no longer be a prestigious public institution. And when they start making those claims, they start to propose a new affirmative action program that wouldn't be limited to the states and would focus on Black students with what they saw as high SAT scores. And also, and this is important, in the documents, it shows that they really preferred Black students living in suburban areas throughout the country. And they would have the capability to go after those students by redistributing general fund dollars that were spent on need-based aid going to opportunity students and redistribute that money into new merit-based scholarships. And so it's a dramatic shift in how affirmative action operated and who it was supposed to serve. Right? Not only were fewer Black students coming from Detroit by the late 1970s, but the socioeconomic background of Black students begin to change in the late 70s and early 80s. Right? If you look at the opportunity program from the early 60s through the early 70s, the program never had an income cap. And so there were middle-class Black students from Detroit and Flint and Grand Rapids that were coming through the university through the opportunity program. But really the limited sources that Bentley has suggests that most of the opportunity program students were coming from families who had unskilled or skilled labor positions. Very small percentage of them were from families who had jobs in the professional sector. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, it's pretty clear that the demographics of Black students are changing and really shifting to middle-class students. And so to make this happen, right, to make the case for this sort of program and this sort of shift, I follow the director of admissions and the director of opportunity program as they start to make claims. They go on basically a public relations campaign to sell this program, to sell this shift. And what they do is they begin attacking the academic capabilities of Black students from Detroit. And I'm going to stop sharing here and play a little clip that I have. And this is one of the really wonderful things that Bentley has. They have some amazing recordings of some of these folks, including George Goodman, who is the director of the opportunity program. And so here's a speech that kind of, it's a kinder critique of students in the Black students in the Detroit public schools, but nevertheless, it gets to the sort of things that they're saying about the Detroit public school system from the mid 70s through the early 80s.
It's clear Cass Tech High School in 1964 and in 1980 still leads the pack with respect to caliber and quality of preparation that the student comes to the university with. Now, I'm concerned in that there has been a little slippage. Little slippage is a whole lot of slippage in some of the other schools, okay? Now, those of you that are from Detroit, could somebody, the new high school Renaissance, is that a functioning? I don't know that much about what's happening. Have they had a graduating class? Another year, okay. In preparation for today, I made a note to myself to try to check out Renaissance because I have no data on what's happening there, but the concept, I suspect, unless someone knows more specifics, is basically the same in that it's my understanding that it is a selective school, and that the best of the students in the whole system, again, will have the opportunity to go there. And they have literally pulled all the better teachers from all of the other schools in the city, and they are now teaching at Renaissance. And I guess what that means is that between Cass and Renaissance, that's where all the quality is. And if you want to come to university, I guess what you really have to do in the 8th grade is to get yourself ready to go to Cass or Renaissance. I don't know whether that all makes a lot of logical sense, but I guess if I were having a youngster at that point in time, I'd have some real concerns listening to some broken down old admissions officer talking about coming to the University of Michigan, and I knew my kid was going to one of the other schools because the statistics clearly would not be in that student's favor.
Okay, so these are the types of claims that these folks are making. And if you know anything about Detroit, you probably heard about Cass. You probably heard about Renaissance. They're the special admit high schools in Detroit. But what they begin to say is that only the students who go to those high schools can possibly do the work at the University of Michigan. And this gets to one of the themes of the book. It gets to one of the tactics that I really try to uncover here. And that the key tactic that administrators use to manipulate what racial inclusion looks like is that they try to control the knowledge about Black students. And part of that process is trying to control the data about Black students that's released to the public. And so if we look at the 1960s and 70s, Michigan administrators are asking for lots of internal research on Black students at the University of Michigan. There's tons of studies in the Bentley Historical Archive library as a result. And in the 60s, so basically what I found is that, when those internal studies support administrators' policy positions, they start pushing those studies out to the public and go out on a public relations campaign, sharing that sort of data with people. So in the 60s, when administrators are really trying to sell the opportunity program, and some folks are pushing back saying, hey, look, the students you're bringing in have really low SAT scores, it's compromising academic quality. What administrators do is they start bringing out these internal studies that researchers at Michigan begin to do on Michigan students that show the SAT has absolutely no predictive value, no value in predicting how Black students in the opportunity program will perform at Michigan. The problem for administrators claiming that students from Detroit and other Michigan cities couldn't cut it at the university was that all of the internal studies said otherwise, right? Nothing that George Goodman said there is supported by any internal study of Black students going to school in Detroit and coming to Michigan, right? So people like George Goodman would start in the 1970s pointing to the higher than average attrition rates of opportunity program students from places like Detroit to show that there's just too few Black Detroit students who could cut it academically at Michigan. But internal studies showed that the majority of opportunity program students who left the university before graduating were in good academic standing, which led a number of researchers to conclude that the poor racial climate had actually more to do with Black students leaving with those attrition rates than students who were having academic struggles. And even for the opportunity students who weren't in good academic standing and leaving the university before graduation, and even then, internal researchers was pushing back and saying that many of those students are perfectly academically capable to do this work. They're not leaving because of that. They're not doing poorly in their class because of that. Also, factors like poor racial climate, family financial struggles, all of those sorts of things play in to how Black students are doing in the classroom at Michigan. And so that's what's out there. That's what they're getting back from internal researchers. And so what I found is these staff members and administrators who are making these sorts of claims are making a deliberate choice not to release the findings of these studies to the university community and the broader public. And so one of the questions that I had when I was going through the archives and I found all of these studies was I wanted to know who got access to them, right? Was it just the people in the admissions office and maybe the opportunity office, and they just didn't share, they hid them, and they didn't share it with anybody? But the Bentley Library is so amazing that it allowed me to see how high up the administrative scale were folks getting this sort of message. I just want to put up a little memo here. This is the sort of thing that I found at Michigan. And so here is a memo to President Robin Fleming in 1972 explaining attrition, right, of the opportunity program. And here you can say kind of a summary of what I just said is that, 7%, I'm going on the second part here. While 7% graduated, another 20% who were enrolled last year did not return in fall 1972. Of that 20%, half were in good academic standing, right? So one may assume that at least some transferred to other institutions. It also may be that our counseling services, which have concentrated largely on students having academic problems, have not adequately addressed the non-academic problems, which might cause a student to drop out, right? So President Fleming was getting this data. It was getting these sort of things. And also there are notes in the archives that show that the Board of Regents were also getting the findings of these particular studies, right? And so what that means is that folks at the highest level of the university allowed and even participated in the attacks on Black Detroit students' academic capabilities. And they chose never to release the findings of these studies to the university community that would contradict these claims, right? That those studies were likely put in a filing cabinet somewhere and forgotten about until archivists at Bentley processed them and put them in a collection for me to find. And so the arguments, right, behind these policies that painted Black Detroit students as incapable of succeeding academically at the University of Michigan were not backed up by any evidence. In fact, all of the evidence contradicted those claims. And yet those arguments have cast a very long shadow at the University of Michigan, informing the university's relationship with Black students in Detroit for decades. Another tactic that I want to briefly cover is hiring, what the University of Michigan does a lot is hire Black folks in staff positions and administrative positions, and they give them basically no power to carry out their duties and really change anything at the University of Michigan. And one of the people that comes out that's related to this story about changing affirmative action practices in the mid-70s to the early 80s is Suitor Casas. She passed away recently in 2019. She has a long history at Michigan. I have this picture to the left of one of the BAM protests outside a parking garage because she was at that protest. She was a key faculty member, untenured, helping Black students organize the Black Action Movement in spring 1970. She almost doesn't get tenure because of it. The Regents really wanted to deny her tenure, but they choose not to at the very last moment. One executive administrator claims that he's the one who convinced the Regents not to deny her tenure. But now, in the early 1980s, suddenly, a decade or more after almost being denied tenure, she has a position as Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, which sounds, really powerful, right? But it's not. She's brought into that position specifically to deal with the declining Black enrollment in the early 1980s and turn that around. And for her, when she looks at the situation, a solution, an important solution for her is to go back and think about Detroit as a prime recruiting ground for Black students, to renew that relationship with Detroit and the University of Michigan. And clearly, Cliff Sjogren, who's director of admissions, doesn't want that to happen. Executive administrators don't want that to happen. And what I find, and this happens a lot when I look through the records of Black administrators, is this optimism that they have that they're going to change things, and soon they figure out that they really have no power and no backing by executive administrators, and that's what Suitor Casas finds. When she gets into her position, she goes to meetings where Cliff Sjogren, the director of admissions, is saying all sorts of bad stuff about Detroit schools, and she thinks at the beginning of her position that really she has the power to push back against Sjogren and kind of put him in his place and get him to kind of start talking about Detroit very differently. And so there's this amazing exchange in the archives between Suitor Casas and Sjogren, where they go back and forth. And Sjogren writes Suitor Casas a letter complaining, a really angry letter complaining that she is critiquing his views about Detroit. And Suitor Casas fires back with this letter. And when you go into the archives, the other executive administrators never really push back against Sjogren, right? There isn't any harsh language, but you can see when you get into Suitor Casas goes after him in a way that he's never been challenged before. I'm just going to read just a little bit from this. That she says, in your letter, you express disappointment over my inaccurate statements. If there's anyone who should be disappointed, it is I, who have been charged with providing leadership to the university in the area of increasing minority enrollment, especially the Black enrollment, and who found reason to believe from your comments that the director of admissions espouses views that might be counterproductive to these efforts. And earlier in this document, she says that your record between 1975 and 1983, and remember that's the declining period in that graph, speaks for itself, right? No one had talked to him in that way, right? And so she really believes that really standing up to him is going to change something. And she quickly figures out that she really doesn't have the power to force Sjogren to do much of anything. And these sort of memos that I'm going to put up right here are the sorts of things that are in the Bentley Historical Library that are very common for Black administrators once they figure out that they really don't have the power to force change. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this that she says, and she's complaining to the vice president of academic affairs who's kind of supervising her here, really has the power. She says, I had to remind myself that I am not in charge with carrying out the programmatic initiatives to reach the minority enrollment goal. My responsibility is basically to advise you and the rest of the executive officers on ways to increase that enrollment, to analyze the university's efforts and to assess their effectiveness. I feel that I am being put in the position of having to take personal responsibility for accomplishing the goals which the university has set, whereas this is not my role. It is the director of admissions, director of financial aid, deans, and others with budgetary and line authority who must take responsibility for effecting the changes that will increase minority enrollment. If these officers do not feel that this can be done, then I will simply have to admit that it cannot be done because they are the ones who will have to do it. I do not have the authority to bring them on board. As you well know, only you and the president can do that, and I hope you will be able to. Yeah, that's a pretty powerful, frustrating statement, right? And to make this even more frustrating, here are something that's going behind the scenes. And this is the other great thing about the archive I can see particular drafts of documents. And this particular draft, and it's hard to see here, is a draft that Cliff Sjogren is writing to try to smooth things over with Nyara Suitor Casas. And one of the other associate vice presidents in the academic affairs office is trying to help Cliff Sjogren write this particular document. And what this shows, I'm going to read what this particular other administrator writes about this particular passage, because this particular passage that is that highlighted here is he's basically doubling down on these statements that Suitor Casas doesn't like. And so here, this person in the academic affairs office says this to Cliff about this statement. Cliff, I'd suggest that this is not be included, since I'm not hearing more about lowering standards. Instead, I'm hearing that we should do more to encourage applications from students who meet our present standards. This is important. I obviously agree with your statement, but it does raise a red flag. I'd suggest that we keep it in reserve for a time, if ever, that it might be needed, right? And so behind the scenes, what's going on in this office that Suitor Casas is a part of are other folks are basically telling Cliff Sjogren, don't worry about Nyara Suitor Casas, right? We support you in these policies, right? Let her make these statements about our lack of commitment to Detroit, but we support these policies. Just stop talking about these policies. Stop talking about Detroit students in a negative way, but keep these policies going. Right? Suitor Casas never sees this, but these efforts to undermine Black administrators are what's especially valuable in the archives that you just don't see. And it makes for an extremely frustrating experience for folks who are put in these particular positions, right? And so what's important here is that, these efforts, this shift in affirmative action policies here, right, that hurt Black Detroit students were only possible in part because the Black administrators who were really invested in challenging them and changing it were given absolutely no power to change them, no power to fire Cliff Sjogren, no power to provide incentives to Cliff Sjogren to change policies. They can only basically advise the vice president of academic affairs, and that's pretty typical of how these positions actually work, right? The last thing that I just want to go over here in this particular story about this shift in affirmative action program here is a shifting language in how administrators talk about affirmative action and these goals. And I just want to play a really quick clip from Harold Shapiro, who's president of the University of Michigan in the early 1980s. And this is the moment when University of Michigan administrators begin to adopt this diversity rationale that's very popular still today. And just for context here, he's giving this speech. Think about this as you're listening to it. He's giving this speech at the 10-year anniversary of the Black Action Movement, where people are gathered to celebrate the Black Action Movement and think about what needs to happen in the decade to come. This is what Harold Shapiro says to an audience of folks really committed to racial justice in the audience.
I feel very comfortable saying one thing, namely that we have to substantially increase minority enrollment here at the University of Michigan. That's desirable in my mind, not because 10 years ago we happened to commit ourselves to a 10% minority enrollment. That's an important factor, but that's not the important factor to me. That's not why it's desirable as far as I'm concerned. The world as a whole is passing into a rather different phase. We're about to pass into a different phase, I believe, in global matters, whereas the cultural experiences, the historical experiences of other cultures altogether, other peoples altogether, are going to play a more and more important and a more dominant role in world affairs. It is therefore extremely important, in my judgment, that the University of Michigan, as it looks forward to participating in that environment, create an environment here on campus which reflects a good deal more cultural diversity and historical experience than has been the case in the first 150 years or so of the university's existence. That is important independent of anything to do with affirmative action. I think it would be desirable if no one here had any concept of affirmative action or any commitment to affirmative action. I think it would be desirable for us to increase not only our enrollment of minority students, but for students around the world in order to enrich in an important way the intellectual experience and of all students here on the University of Michigan. So there's no question that we have fallen short of the BAM goal, if that's the way you want to look at it. That's not the way I look at it. I think we've simply fallen far short of what is a desirable goal for a great university facing the next decade or two of world experience, at least as I see it.
So I start to see this shift in the early 1980s, and I'm running out of time here, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time because this is important. See the shift in language and how people talk about efforts to increase minority enrollment. And diversity becomes, in the early 1980s, useful to administrators for a few reasons. One, they want to get away from that social justice rationale that connected affirmative action to kind of trying to root out inequality in cities. Two, they wanted to make the goals of these admissions programs that try to increase minority enrollment, they wanted to try to make them ambiguous, right? They didn't like the BAM goals because there was a clear 10% goal and it was easy to hold them accountable. Year after year, they failed and they would be critiqued, right? Diversity allowed for a very ambiguous goal. You can see here in that talk, and it never happens in the early 1980s, no one ever states how many Black, Asian American, Hispanic, Indigenous students would be necessary to provide a diverse student body, to provide the educational benefits of diversity, right? No one ever thinks about that. They don't think about that on purpose because they don't want numerical goals anymore because they don't want to be held accountable. They wanted it to make it ambiguous. And two, the other issue here is they want to stop talking about Black students and start talking about minority students more generally. Because if you start talking about minority students more generally, what you find, and I think I made a mistake here and didn't share the screen properly. Hopefully that will come up. The bottom line here between 1976 and 1983 is Black enrollment declining. The top line is total minority enrollment. The bottom line is a story of failure. The top line is a story of progress and success. And administrators were desperate to tell a story of progress and success on racial inclusion. And they wanted to get away from talking about Black students and really kind of expanding to think about minority enrollment. And so you'll see, you remember in that talk, he says minority over and over again, but not Black, right? So big shifts in the way that they talk about things. And so I'm going to stop there because I'm a little bit over time, and I want to would love to kind of have a conversation and listen to some questions. But this, for me, this big shift between 1975 and 1983, generally a period that's kind of overlooked in Michigan's history, but I see it as one of the most important periods in Michigan's history.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. That's great. That's what a great way to start this. First of all, I want to say to people watching, we will get to we will get to audience Q&A in about 15 minutes or so, and you can enter your questions into the comments on YouTube, and we'll pick them up. But first, we're going to have just a little bit of a discussion, and I thought this was really a very concise, compressed way to get into so many issues. Too many, I'm sure, for us to cover in the amount of time we have. And this idea, first of all, of ignoring evidence, of ignoring the voices of Black students about their actual experiences on campus, as opposed to just sort of assuming that attrition was due to poor academic preparation and so forth, or academic failing, and these struggles that these Black administrators, like Suitor Casas, were having with their administrative colleagues. It really paints. It sets forth all these tensions that are going on, and I guess what I want to start with is just a little bit step before to that uprising part of the graph, which I know, as you said, was more dramatic in the way that it was presented than was actually the case. But what led to the point where it could? What was it that led to the point where it could get to this point, where there actually were, so to speak, African American administrators in place to fight this struggle? If I could ask it that way, and where, for instance, what's behind the Opportunity Program? So that's a little bit of a broad question. So whatever you can do with that.
Yeah. So the Opportunity Program that's put into place in 1964, fall 1964, is the first class of Opportunity Program students. The original name was Opportunity Award students, and it was changed to Opportunity Program. But it's a really interesting story, the origins of affirmative action admissions at the undergraduate level at Michigan. It doesn't come from student pressure at all. It comes actually from the origins of it come from Black folks fighting for access to jobs around the country. And what it creates is an affirmative action program within the Kennedy administration, which eventually leads to the University of Michigan. An alum, Hobart Taylor, is brought into the Kennedy administration to kind of manage Executive Order 10925, and basically what happens is he comes to the University of Michigan campus to really put pressure on the University of Michigan to begin hiring Black folks outside of really menial positions, and to start hiring more Black professors. And that's what Michigan thinks that he's there for. To basically kind of deal with federal compliance within the Kennedy administration, because Michigan's a big contractor with the federal government. The next day that he's there, he says, "Oh, by the way, we need you to start enrolling more Black students." And Kennedy himself begins to place pressure on universities like Michigan to start enrolling more Black students. The idea was that these sort of working class industrial jobs were going away. And there will be an uprising in cities when young Black folks don't have those opportunities in manufacturing positions. And so there's basically this rush in the early 1960s to find an outlet in higher education for Black students, potential Black students in higher education, living in places like Detroit and Flint and Grand Rapids. And so it really is an effort by the federal government to try to push these institutions of higher ed to help the federal government deal with what they see as a potential crisis in cities and potential urban uprisings. And so it's a story that I never thought that I would find. I never thought that would ever be the case at the University of Michigan. But I think it's a surprising story that affirmative action admissions would be connected to this push for affirmative action hiring.
Thank you. Yeah. So another thing, so in terms of, all the things you lay out, I mean, the ignoring of evidence, the struggle, and this notion of promoting an ambiguous view of admissions, and particularly admissions with respect to African American students. So part of this, on the one hand, is like any institution's efforts to always paint what it's doing in a good light, right? But there is also this thing that you draw out in many ways in the book. And I mean, it is this kind of decision between a vision of the university as a paragon of academic excellence versus really adopting something like racial justice or equality as a really core part of the mission. You say in several ways, for instance, that so much of the focus of what it is to be excellent, so much of the idea of merit is based on who you let in, not how they do once they get here, not how they do, what happens after they leave. And I wonder if you could say just a bit more about that, about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, that is, the first chapter of this book goes all the way back to the Michigan's founding, and there in the early minutes, you see the folks who are trying to build this university, these conflicting goals that they have. And one is to build what they really wanted was an institution that can compete with Harvard, a public institution that could compete with Harvard. And on the other hand, this institution that would have broad access. And so I kind of follow that conflict throughout the 19th century. And in every instance, when those two things kind of come up against each other, and the University of Michigan has to make a choice, which one to privilege, they always choose policies that are supposed to make the university on par with the most prestigious universities in the country. Whether that means when they have to make a choice in the 19th century between raising tuition outside of the ability of a lot of people within Michigan in order to build an institution with lots of research facilities and that sort of thing. They choose to raise tuition and try to build a research institution, right? In every turn, they choose they choose prestige over access over and over and over. So it's something that's so deeply rooted in the University of Michigan. The Black Action Movement activist calls it, this is in the bones and sinews of the place, right? It's so deeply rooted in what the University of Michigan does that it just seems automatic, right? You don't even really have to think about it. This is just kind of the default that Michigan goes to.
Yeah, and even, I mean, as you point out, also in some situations where students themselves, I mean, activists themselves find themselves forced to sort of deform their messaging in order to try to appeal to on the basis of these kinds of values, right? Mm-hmm. Which is also, again, partly what administrators are doing. I mean, they're reacting, and even some well-thinking people have a hard time getting outside of this kind of a mindset, right? And so this is a terribly, I suppose, unfair question, but what would it be? What would it have been like if it had been different? I mean, what might it have been like if it had gone differently at some crucial point?
Yeah, I think that this gets to the core of a mission. What do we want to do in higher education? What are our goals? And I think that the best thinkers right now in higher education are thinking about our missions, and if we think about prestige, is the way that we measure whether we're doing things right or not. Right, and there are lots of different ways to have different values at the center of a mission. One scholar writes about what if we were to take advancing, making democracy better as a core mission of the university. Right, our admissions practice would change dramatically, and the way that we would measure how we're doing would be completely different. Right, and so at the core of changing the core of a university's mission and how we judge and measure whether the university is doing things right is essentially important. Yeah, I mean, the issue is for the University of Michigan, and I try to show this in the book, is that Michigan is working within a system that they help create, but not totally create, right?
Mhm.
If they want to have the status of a prestigious university, there's a system set up for what that means, right? And for them, if they still want to be a prestigious university, and they want to make racial justice its core, right, this core mission,
Mhm.
it would need to really push back on this larger system that we have to judge all universities around the country, right? And it's just something that the University of Michigan hasn't been willing to do, in my opinion, right?
Mhm.
They have a choice. Like they could really put some effort into changing how we kind of judge prestige, but they have continually kind of just adopted that definition of
Yeah.
prestige.
Right, right. And of course, now there are lots of forces underway now that may change that system irrespective of what places like University of Michigan does, right?
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things you point out in the book too is, how different the approach was at different points that U of M took to international students, as opposed to racial students. I mean, racial issues, and not so much in the period you were talking about in this particular talk tonight. But I wonder if you just say a little bit more about that, as kind of a counter study, right? I mean, it really could have gone differently based on some of U of M's practices.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back into especially the period around World War II, the university basically the demand for higher education really explodes. They have lots of groups who they think are valuable, but really aren't competitive in the admissions system, right? And they're willing, all the way back into the 1930s and 1940s, to come up with rationales to still admit those students, including international students. There's a bunch of complaints from faculty members in the early 20th century that, look, these international students that are admitted here just aren't cutting it in the classroom. We need to really kind of change the way that we evaluate them. And Michigan doesn't do that. They come up with rationales to say, hey, this is extremely important to our mission and what we want to do here, right? And we need to admit those students regardless of whether they're competitive in the admissions process. The same with veterans, the same with men, right? Because in the post-war period, women are scoring much higher on things like the SAT, and they want to make sure that men are still competitive in the admissions process and women don't begin to outnumber men. And so they come up with rationales to make sure that men have greater access to women despite the fact that they're not as competitive in the admissions process. So Michigan's willing to do that, right, all throughout the early 20th century. But one group that they're not willing to do that for until the early 1960s are African Americans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So then, too, I mean, so in the quote that you, the audio you played from Shapiro's talk, and talking a lot about minorities, talking about a lot about the need for other cultures to come to campus and be exposed to other cultures on campus, which very much leads right into this. I mean, this is very much continuous with stuff that has gone on well into the century we're currently in. And I wonder if you could just give a quick overview about that. I mean, how this leads to our diversity ideas today in some ways.
Yeah, at Michigan, certainly this is kind of the roots of it. There are people talking about in diversity language long before this. Even back when we think about the international students I was just talking about, some of that diversity rationale comes out there. It's just not until the early 1980s that administrators start saying that a lot about Black students. You see kind of a few instances in the early 1970s, but it's never popular. It's really beginning in the early 1980s. And it's useful for all the reasons that I pointed out and some others that are related to the rise of neoliberalism and things like that. But one way that it begins to take hold, I think, and this is a kind of a surprising story, and I give James Duderstadt, who takes over for Shapiro in the late 1980s. We often think about diversity language in the worst ways, and I think for good reason. But not everyone has thought about that diversity rationale as a way to try to limit Black enrollment, right? When you get into one of the really surprising things I found once I got into the late 1980s, early 1990s with James Duderstadt is he was really invested in trying to convince people at the university to support a much more aggressive affirmative action program. And he thought a lot about how to do this. He brought in consultants in to start thinking about this sort of stuff. And he really loved diversity, not because it was limiting Black enrollment, but because he thought it was the only way to convince much of the faculty and students on campus to support an aggressive affirmative action program. Because by the late 1980s, he's like, look, that social justice rationale that was popular in the 1960s, that's just not, it doesn't get the same sort of support anymore. And even if I like it, it's a hard sell to people, right? And so what you need to do, he thought in the late 1980s, and why he liked diversity, was that it let white folks see that they had a self-interest, right? That you needed to show any of these sorts of programs that benefited Black folks or any sort of minoritized groups. You needed to show white folks that it benefited them in some way, right? If they thought it harmed them, it was going to collapse, right? And so I think that's a story about diversity that really doesn't get told. And I do think that it's one of the reasons why it becomes even more popular in the 1990s. And obviously, the lawsuits that come in the late 80s through the 1990s make diversity almost essential to the discourse in order to prepare for potential court cases as well. Right? I can't really overlook that as a reason. But diversity has a very complicated history, not just as a way to actually put down, try to suppress Black enrollment. And the other thing I just want to say real quickly is that there are times throughout this history when Black students see hope in that diversity discourse. Mm-hmm. And they begin to try to experiment with it and to try to use diversity to rationalize the sorts of policy changes that they want, right? And administrators try to put that down real quick because diversity is not useful for them, right? If it's going to start to actually rationalize policies that they don't want to put into place. But there are moments when Black students really do see a lot of hope in diversity and think that they can use it, but it really falls apart pretty quickly.
Thank you. So we have some questions coming in. I want to turn to audience questions now. Let's see, could you talk more about your research process? Did you use the data of Black enrollment to guide how you identified important documents, or did you have a set of pre-assigned research questions?
Oh man, that's a great question. So I started this project with a really basic question of what happens after social movements win. And obviously it's evolved a lot since then, right? But I really wanted to take this moment. And at Michigan, looking at 1970 and then 1975, where there's another protest in the late 1980s when another big protest, I wanted to see, here are these moments where they win concessions, not so much in 1975, but when they win big concessions, what happens afterwards? Because I thought a lot of the scholarship really kind of told the story of activism up until that moment. And then they might at the end be like, oh yeah, well, okay, not a whole lot happened. They're like, well, what happened at the end that didn't allow those sort of big victories that we think would actually happen. And so in that case, I really wanted to really identify the periods where there was a protest and look at those immediate aftermath and kind of stretch that out as far as I could to see how administrators were reacting to it and what sort of policies that they formed, what sort of commitments did they actually have, all of those sorts of strategies that came out in the book. And so I just kind of went to work. I really, early in my career, I did not have the best strategies to kind of go after this sort of stuff. I kind of really dove in to the archives, and I started to figure out at Bentley. Number one, Bentley, we always have a problem of historians is one, having not enough material. The problem at Bentley is there is so much material that it's like, where do I start? Once I started diving in, I started to figure out how archivists are processing collections, and generally kind of what their tactics are and schemes are. And once I kind of figured that out about like where the really good stuff would be, I could kind of follow those schemes a little bit. So it wasn't so much of a fishing expedition. But yeah, I'm very much someone who's driven by research questions to start. And then the other thing that I didn't do early on as a graduate student was make better relationships with archivists. Like I was like, had very, very bad anxiety in graduate school. And I always thought that I was this massive burden to archivists, like just showing up there. And as if like they didn't, but they actually really want to talk to you and guide you through. And so once I like got that anxiety out of the way, the archivist there really kind of pushed me in the right directions.
That's great. I should say that I can't imagine any of my colleagues who are actual archivists, which I am not. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm associated with the Bentley, that they see anybody. I mean, anybody as a burden. They love to help. So. Somebody points out. I mean, this is kind of just to follow up. That Harold Cruse came to U of M in the 60s, and largely as a result of student activism. And how much did you talk to activists? Did you interview any of the people from BAM or other sorts of activists?
Yeah, a little bit. Some activists, would just kind of email back and forth with me. I was, much more interested in obviously the administrative response in this book than actually getting into the nitty-gritty details of kind of social movement stories. But absolutely, I talked to some activists. The Harold Cruse story, though, is really interesting. And so it does come out of student activism. In the mid-1960s, there is one of the really earliest kind of protest movements in the 1960s among Black students is in the mid-60s, trying to get a history professor to teach Black history. And the history department pushes back against that, doesn't want it. And there's this big letter, there's kind of, they have lots of signatures from students all across campus to try to hire someone. The history department says there's absolutely no qualified Black historian to teach Black history anywhere in the country. They come back with a list of Black scholars. They're like, this is a list of Black historians who are amazing. That's a bunch of crap, basically, we were telling us. And so there's this movement that really doesn't come of anything in the mid-1960s, really until 1968, when there's a protest on campus that's about more than hiring a history professor. Out of that, another department actually recruits Harold Cruse for a temporary position. And suddenly the history department's like, oh, this is an opportunity for us. And that's how Harold Cruse got a bit more of a long-term position at the University of Michigan to kind of solve this problem of someone teaching Black history. And clearly his career is much bigger than teaching Black history. But this is kind of like the weird end around story of how Harold Cruse was here for a long time.
Well, it's amazing. And I mean, he is certainly now renowned as one of the great, certainly one of the great U of M faculty members of the second half of the last century, and I think very, very few people know about how he actually came to Michigan.
Yeah, one of my mentors went to who's an undergraduate in the 1970s when Harold Cruse was there, and he was like, when he came to campus, he was committed to talking to Harold Cruse. And he would come to his office all the time, and he's like, he was never there. He was never there. I never got to talk to him.
Let's see. So here's a question about well, this is also about how administrators and activists might interact. Duderstadt had been Shapiro's provost during BAM 3. But then the question says he listened and consulted with many of the activists themselves in the late 80s. Activists taught him and swayed him from Shapiro's policy. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that is partly true. I think that Duderstadt was definitely more open to activist positions than Shapiro was. If you read my book, Shapiro does not come off very well in the book. I think he was an incredibly damaging administrator as both president, and also he was in an executive position before that. Basically throughout most of the period when those affirmative action policies were put into place, he was either, I believe, vice president of academic affairs or president. And he is someone who allows racial retrenchment to continue through a lot of the 1980s. It was a good thing for Black activists in the 1980s that he took the job at Princeton, and Duderstadt came into office. Duderstadt absolutely was someone who was a listener. I've interviewed him several times. James Duderstadt has basically attached his legacy to the Michigan Mandate and his response to BAM 3. And whether you agree with his policies or not, he's willing to talk to anybody because he wants to talk about what he did after BAM 3. He certainly, talked to activists, but he did not have a great relationship with a lot of activists during that period, like Barbara Ransby, for example, who's a very famous history professor right now. When I go back into the documents, and someone who wrote this question might have been there and have a different experience, but when I look at the documents there, the folks in UCAR and BAM 3 don't necessarily appreciate Duderstadt all that much during his early years. And so certainly he listens to folks. I think that what pushes him even more during this period is he doesn't want to see another BAM 4, and he wants to make sure that doesn't happen again. And you can see that in a lot of the documents that I go through, is we're trying to develop a strategy to try to suppress people like Barbara Ransby really early by getting a lot of initiatives out real quick, and then having more control over the process if you suppress activism and the power of activism real quick. Now you have more power as an administrator because you're not getting that pressure as much. And so another thing that the Bentley Historical Library has, which is amazing, is that Duderstadt has in the files like strategy documents for how to deal with BAM 3 and make sure that they don't have a lot of power after that protest. Okay, it's like why he kept those documents, I don't know.
Well, so it was explicit, but this is also another theme of the book, right? I mean, it is how to yield just enough to damp down or tamp down the possibility of protest, while still kind of maintaining what is seen as the core mission of an elite institution.
Yeah.
So you just, as you just said, I mean, why are those particular records still around? Well, here's a question about the archives, right? Did you identify any particular bias or weighing in terms of what was or wasn't preserved? Were there any perspectives that you wanted to see more?
Yes, certainly. So this is one thing that's unique to Bentley, is that if you go through archives around the country, they're generally biased in preserving people at the very top of the administration. One thing that's unique to Bentley is they have so much stuff from people down the administrative scale, which is really unique. Even given that, though, the folks who are getting in some of the nitty-gritty day-to-day activities generally are not folks who are preserving materials, and the Bentley is kind of hunting for those sorts of documents. And so for folks like that, I relied a lot more sometimes on the statements that they made in the Michigan Daily or something like that. Mm-hmm. But it was harder to get to some of those folks. And so that's certainly where some of the, I guess, bias in kind of creating archives comes in, of like, who do we think is important? The Center for Afro-American and African-American Studies have done an amazing job at actually collecting a lot of stuff from students. Mm-hmm. And also the audio clips that I included are from their particular collection. And so they also, I think, deserve a lot of credit for what we know about Black students. Certainly, I think that there could have been more of an effort in those moments to try to collect more stuff from activists, right? But that wasn't the case. Still, there's a lot of good stuff there. But certainly, pretty much all university archives are biased in terms of the important people are at the top, the non-important people are at the bottom. Bentley, I think, is unique in the amount of effort they actually try to get stuff from people at the mid-scale and kind of bottom scale of the administrative structure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And made with the hashtag BBUM movement, made a concerted effort to collect that kind of
yeah. And also digitize stuff too,
yes,
coming out of that particular movement, which has been great.
Right.
When I was doing research, I had to pay to digitize a lot of things. And since then, like if I would have written this like 10 years ago, I wouldn't have to spend like so much money digitizing, old cassette tapes and reel-to-reel tapes and things like that. After hashtag BBUM, a lot of that stuff was actually digitized after I'd already paid for it.
Right. So I know you do discuss this a little bit in the book, but this is a question: is it possible to talk about movements at U of M without discussing SDS, the anti-war teach-ins? I mean, Tom Hayden was at U of M, and what cross-pollination might there have been?
Yeah, it's a great question. I talk about this in the book. If you look at the night before spring 1970, when we get the Black Action Movement, administrators really were not scared of Black student activism much at all, even after there's a building takeover in 1968, where Black students going to take over a building. SDS at Michigan,
which we should just say was the Student Democratic Society.
That's right.
This was the anti-war and others.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That administrators considered that the biggest threat on campus. They were scared as hell of SDS. And in fact, President Fleming at the time went out and asked for legal advice about how to deal with SDS without creating police violence, right? Because he was very scared about what would happen if the police came in and kind of put down an SDS particular protest. But one thing that SDS does is that they try very hard to push Black student activists in a much more radical direction, and to try to get them to be much more forceful in a protest movement. They're often actually really critical of Black students for what they see as kind of a lackluster protest movement in the late 1960s. During the Black Action Movement, there are stories of SDS trying to give the Black Action Movement guns. But I think one thing that there's certainly cross-pollination between movements. SDS folks that are involved in the anti-war movement become part of the Black Action Movement. The Black Action Movement wouldn't have succeeded if it didn't have widespread support outside of Black students on campus. One important thing that we might not think about is in terms of one of the reasons why the Black Action Movement was successful, because administrators were so scared of what was happening on campus. And one of the reasons why that they were so scared was in part because they were already prepped to be scared by SDS, right? Their anxiety of protest and what could happen as the result of protesting on campus was there because of SDS. And so the Black Action Movement in some ways kind of piggybacks and benefits from that sort of anxiety that's kind of pulsing through administrators in the late 60s and early 1970s. And there's this feeling of a need to try to get protests over with as quickly as possible so there won't be violence. And I think that's one of the things that led administrators to concede to more of the BAM demands than they really wanted to. They're very scared about violence.
Well, you also mentioned, you talk in the book also about how the 1967 Detroit Rebellion played a role in how people were, how administrators were viewing the potential for violence from. Yeah,
absolutely. And so that's another layer of it when they're thinking about anxiety and what could possibly happen. Robin Fleming, who's president at the time, is writing during the Black Action Movement that he's actually really scared that Black folks who were involved in the 1967 uprising are going to come to Ann Arbor and join the Black Action Movement protests, and we're going to see something similar to Detroit 1967 in Ann Arbor.
Wow, yeah. Can you talk about, this is a question, can you talk about about people the university administration sent to disrupt the student activists themselves?
I don't know what specifically they're mentioning, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of how that comes out in the book a bit, and hopefully it answers the question in the way that this person wants it to be answered. In terms of sending people out to disrupt student activists, in the late 1960s, as I said, administrators are very worried about bringing in the police. They're very fearful about what might happen. After the Black Action Movement, for the very first time, Michigan hires police officers to be on campus. So it's kind of the origins of the campus police. And they also create a position of someone who's simply supposed to, well, part of his position is supposed to be kind of surveil student movements and try to suppress them and try to anticipate them. And certainly there's a new sort of surveillance system that we start to see in the 1970s that is really meant to disrupt student activism. Something else that the university is not really a part of. You would think that they might have a bigger role in kind of helping the FBI disrupt student protests, but I didn't find that, at least in the records. The FBI is certainly on campus in the late 60s. Lots of FBI documents that says that. And in fact, the FBI is sending fake letters to the University of Michigan to Robin Fleming, positioning themselves as citizens of Michigan, saying that you are too weak as a president, you know, like step down. And so they're trying to kind of give Michigan administrators a sense that there's far more criticism of the university than there really is out there in the public. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, well, thank you. Oh, okay. So here we're getting into discussion of current activities, and you can defer or not. But what do you think of the university's current non-efforts and rhetoric? There again seems to be an administrator of diversity, equity, and inclusion without much power.
Yeah. So the tools that I bring out in this book are ongoing, and clearly, and you know, I try when I talk about the current efforts, I try. Not to critique the folks that come into those positions, because they're working hard in those positions. And many of them really think that even given the limitations that they're placed in, that they can make some change. And I really don't want to fault them for that and seem like that they're doing an awful job or anything. But certainly this sort of strategy is still there. The folks that are generally in those particular positions, as I said, let's say you wanted to go after admissions, you really need the power to fire people. And that's what set James Duderstadt actually apart from all presidents before him, is that he basically fired Cliff Sjogren, who was responsible for that the changes that I talked about today. In his words, he let him retire. And so you have to have the power to do those sorts of things, and also have the power to provide incentives. And so what Duderstadt also does is he ties merit raises to putting in the sort of affirmative action policies that he wants and making those sorts of efforts. The people in DEI positions generally don't have any of that sort of power. They are in kind of consulting positions. Also, they kind of see them. Top tier administrators see them as educators, and that's often how they see kind of Black administrators, is kind of their power comes from convincing people around the university to change by educating them. That's what the first affirmative action officer was in charge of hiring. That was basically the amount of her power that she figured out, was that she would go to departments around the university and try to convince them that affirmative action was a good idea. She couldn't do anything about it. She basically collected data and did that. It's a very frustrating position to be in. And so it just hasn't changed.
Yeah, and you know, to make an analogy, I mean, with something else you discuss, I mean, the way that government power is brought to bear on this issue. I mean, you make the distinction between weak coercion and strong coercion from the federal government in particular, and the ways in which when the government is not sufficiently forceful in its approach or its demands, then it allows institutions more or less to just accommodate, but basically continue what they're doing. And so there's a similar kind of a...
That's right. And that's a...
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, that's a story that comes out in the early 1960s when Michigan puts together the first affirmative action admissions program. The federal government really, its only power was in sort of hiring. And so it was really just pressuring Michigan to try to set up an affirmative action admissions program. And so it really didn't have oversight over that. And so there's kind of weak coercion there. And luckily for for the federal government, there was an administrator at that moment who was actually sympathetic to affirmative action admissions efforts, and he was the one who kind of put that into place. But without the sort of oversight from the federal government really trying to shape and pressuring Michigan to practice affirmative action in a particular way or meet particular goals, the institution was allowed to just create affirmative action in any way that they thought what was necessary. And throughout the 1960s, it was very much a very slow rise as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, ideologies are difficult things to change, right? And partly persuasion is clearly important in that effort, but persuasion is typically not enough, right? I mean,
yeah, and one thing that
changes.
Absolutely. One thing that I wanted to bring out that I wasn't able to is I went back and listened to some of the Black activists who returned in 1980 for the 10-year anniversary, and they were kind of thinking about how protest works and the power of protest and how to change an institution. Because I've been thinking a lot lately about like how much can we actually change through protest, working through the system, right? And Cynthia Stevens, who's one of the most important activists in BAM, who later becomes a judge in Michigan, talks about, he's like, these protests are important because they can create temporary change. And it's temporary, right? You have to keep fighting for it and keep pressuring and keep pressuring and keep pressuring, because this kind of this process of co-optation is going to start pretty quickly. At Michigan. And it's a frustrating process to have to continue to fight year after year after year and know that one big protest is not going to solve everything and change the big sort of values of an institution. It's a constant process of pressure and slow change. And it's frustrating. One of the things that I've been thinking about too, going back to those videos, because the Center for Afro-American and African Studies recorded those workshops, is that one of the activists said that we know the change probably isn't going to happen, but we're going to fight anyway. Yeah. Right? And I've been thinking a lot about how much I respect folks who know that they're probably going to lose, but they do it anyway.
I think we can do one last question. How about the strategy of interpreting the can't use race legal language as not propping up white-dominated admissions?
Okay, I need to read this for a second to understand.
I think this might be, I'm not sure about the legal language. I was wondering if this was a reference to just racial liberalism and the idea of,
yeah, I mean, I think what they're trying to say is the sort of idea that color blindness itself doesn't prop up sort of kind of white-dominated institutions. The Black Action Movement, for example, if you look at a lot of their documents, basically what they're trying to do is counter exactly that. That you really kind of have to think about race and think about institutional racism, and you can't really solve this through color blindness. It's a very difficult process for Michigan administrators because racial liberalism, the sort of idea of racism is really due to individual prejudice. If you just get race out of the way factor, right? That's kind of your goal. That had really dominated Michigan administrators' thinking throughout the late 40s and 1950s and early 1960s. It was very difficult for administrators to kind of realize that sort of thinking kind of reinforced white-dominated institutions, and it took a long time for them to even acknowledge that. And so even the early affirmative action programs, and this is kind of their way of trying to deal with this, so trying to kind of come to terms with the failures of racial liberalism, is that opportunity program on the surface was colorblind because it didn't actually say anything about race. But it really kind of focused specifically on areas that were dominated by Black students. And so it was kind of their way around. They were kind of uncomfortable thinking about race. They still committed to colorblindness, but they knew colorblindness wasn't quite working. And so there's a very interesting transition in the early 1960s that are happening there. And they slowly kind of begin to change that sort of framework.
So we'll make this will be the last question then. Is there any discussion in the archives on what was owed to Black students?
No.
Which kind of cuts to the heart of the issue, right? I mean,
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the basic message throughout most of the archives and from administrators is Michigan owes Black students nothing.
Yeah.
And in fact, the way that I generally read a lot of the archives is that Black students are really a burden on the university. And the university is doing this in a nice thing for Black students, and they should be happy about it. That sort of messaging is through a lot of the documents at the University of Michigan. Not all, but it's pretty prominent.
Yeah. Well, and now I guess in so many ways you see so much of this writ large in political and socio-political discussions in this country. I mean, the reaction to Black Lives Matter, the sort of the insane attacks on critical race theory coming out of just complete misunderstanding or more clearly purposeful misrepresentation. I mean, this is sadly so much of the history of race relations in the country, it seems, not just at universities like Michigan.
That's right. I have some hope living in teaching in conservative Texas that students are kind of willing to engage with critical race theory and thinking about that sort of stuff. So I have hope. I try to stay hopeful, but it's hard.
Yeah. Well, that's great, and we do. We have to have hope, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you so much, Matthew. This has been really great, really enlightening. And again, I want to say to people who are watching that the book just contains a wealth of information that we were not able to cover, and I highly recommend it. I know I learned just a tremendous amount out of it, even about many things that I thought I already knew pretty thoroughly, but clearly didn't. I want to thank Lara Zeeland for her behind the screen support. And as well, also the Michigan media team, which has managed tonight's event. I want to say to our audience, thank you as well for your questions and for your attention. This session will be available on YouTube at some point soon. And I hope you will join us in October when Bentley archivists Greg Kinney and Brian Williams will talk about the Bentley's collection of U of M football game films, which have just recently been digitized and published, what they learned from the project, and some things they'd like to share. So until we see you again in October, thank you again, Matthew, and to everyone, be safe and stay well, and good night.